The wind howled across the massive landfill on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, carrying the stench of rot and broken dreams. Daniel Walker, a poor single father, moved slowly between mountains of discarded metal and torn garbage bags, his worn gloves scraping against rusted cans as he searched for anything that could be traded for a few dollars. His life had become a routine of survival, measured in scraps and coins, until something impossible shattered the silence of that morning. Between twisted steel and filthy plastic, he saw a pale hand emerge from beneath a pile of trash, trembling faintly, as if calling for help from another world. And in that instant, fear and destiny collided in his chest, because nothing about that hand belonged in a place like this, and what he found next would change his life forever. But he had no idea this was only the beginning. As Daniel pulled away debris in panic, the horrifying truth revealed itself. A woman, barely breathing, her designer clothes torn and stained with blood, her skin bruised as if she had been violently dragged across asphalt. Just a few yards away, hidden behind a slope of trash, he spotted the unmistakable outline of a luxury car, crushed against scrap like a fallen beast. There were tire marks in the dirt, sharp and aggressive, suggesting a sudden chase, not an accident. Whoever she was, she had fled for her life and ended up here. Daniel's hands began to shake as he realized that saving her might mean inviting something far darker into his already fragile existence. At that moment, everything started to change. Every single day before sunrise, Daniel left their tiny trailer on the south side of Phoenix with his 8-year-old son Ethan still asleep inside, hugging a faded superhero blanket. The trailer rattled with the desert wind, its walls thin and unforgiving, much like the life they lived inside. Daniel worked 2 part-time jobs when he could, but most days he survived by collecting scrap metal from illegal dumps and abandoned construction sites, selling what he found for whatever the yards would pay. Some days he earned $20. On lucky ones, $40, and on the worst ones, nothing at all. But he never complained in front of his son, because for Daniel, pain was something you swallowed quietly, and pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. But destiny was quietly watching his every step. At night, Daniel cooked cheap meals on a single burner, pretending canned soup was a feast and stale bread was enough to keep hunger silent. Ethan never asked for toys, never begged for brand-name shoes, and that broke Daniel even more than if he had. The boy had learned too early that dreams were expensive. Daniel often sat awake long after his son fell asleep, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering how his life had collapsed so completely, and whether it was already too late to fix it. But deep down, something told him the universe wasn't done with him yet, and it was right. Years earlier, Daniel had been a mechanic with his own small garage, a rented space on the edge of Phoenix where neighborhood families trusted him with their cars and their stories. He wasn't rich, but he was stable. He had a wife named Melissa, the love of his life, and together they dreamed of expanding the shop, buying a small home, and giving their son everything they never had. But one rainy night, a drunk driver ran a red light and shattered that future in seconds. Melissa was killed instantly. Daniel survived with broken ribs, shattered hope, and a guilt so heavy it nearly crushed him alive. From that day forward, every breath felt borrowed, and every dream felt dangerous, but the pain was far from over. The medical bills destroyed his savings. The garage closed within months. Friends slowly faded away, and without even noticing, Daniel went from respected mechanic to invisible reject of society. He never spoke about Melissa anymore, not because he had forgotten her, but because the memory hurt too much to survive out loud. Ethan asked about his mother less each year, as if even the child felt the weight of that silence. Daniel told himself he could handle anything as long as his son was alive and breathing beside him at night. But what he didn't know was that the past had not finished collecting its debts, and neither had fate. He told himself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on his mind, the kind that comes from too many sleepless nights and too many worries stacked on top of each other. But the feeling only grew stronger. That morning at the landfill, before he found the woman, he had dropped his metal hook twice for no reason at all, his hands trembling without explanation. Even the birds seemed to scatter when he approached certain areas, as if danger lingered invisibly in the air. Daniel had lived among danger for years: rusted steel, collapsing heaps of junk, unstable ground. But this felt different, heavier, almost alive. And he couldn't explain why his chest felt tight, as if some unseen force were pulling him forward toward a moment he was powerless to avoid. But he had no idea this was only the beginning. Later that same morning, Daniel spotted fresh tire tracks cutting sharply through the dirt near the edge of the dump, something extremely unusual in that isolated area. The marks were deep and aggressive, made by expensive tires, nothing like the old trucks that usually pass by to unload trash illegally. He stood there for a moment, staring at those tracks, a strange chill creeping up his spine. Something violent had happened here recently, that much was undeniable. And without realizing it, Daniel's steps began to follow those tracks instinctively, drawing him closer to the heart of a mystery that would soon pull his entire life apart. But he was still unaware of how deeply everything was about to change. By the time he reached the slope where the trash had recently shifted, the air felt heavier, thick with silence. Even the constant noise of distant machinery seemed to fade into the background. His instincts screamed for him to turn back. He thought of Ethan waiting for him at home, of how fragile their existence already was. Getting involved in anything suspicious could destroy the little stability they had left. But just as he turned to walk away, he heard it. A faint, broken breath that didn't belong to the dump. His heart dropped into his stomach as he realized he was no longer alone in a place where no one was supposed to survive, and that sound would haunt him forever. Daniel rushed toward the sound, his boots sliding on loose debris as he shoved aside broken appliances and ripped black bags with frantic strength. Then he saw her clearly for the first time. A woman in her early 30s, her face pale, her lips cracked, her breathing weak and irregular. Her once elegant clothes were ruined, expensive fabric torn and soaked with dirt and blood. One of her arms was bent at an unnatural angle. Her hair, dark and glossy despite the filth, stuck to her bruised face. She looked like she belonged to a completely different world, violently thrown into Daniel's miserable reality. And in that second, fear overwhelmed him, because nothing about this made sense, and what happened next would shock everyone. A few steps away, partially hidden behind twisted scrap, he noticed the wreckage of a black Mercedes SUV, its front smashed beyond repair, its windshield shattered inward like it had collided at full speed. The engine was still warm. This had happened recently, maybe minutes ago. The realization hit Daniel like a punch to the chest. Whoever she was, she hadn't been dumped here hours earlier. She had escaped something terrifying and collapsed right in front of his regular hunting ground. His mind raced with questions he couldn't yet answer. Was she running from criminals? From kidnappers? From someone powerful? And more importantly, would they come back for her? The woman's eyes fluttered open just long enough to meet his. Confusion, terror, and desperate pleading flashed in her gaze. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then she lost consciousness again. Daniel froze, torn between instinct and terror. Every warning in his head screamed that helping her could destroy his life and put his son in mortal danger. Yet every ounce of humanity he still had refused to let him walk away from a dying woman. And in that unbearable moment of hesitation, fate placed its first heavy chain firmly around his soul. Daniel took 2 steps back, shaking his head as if he could physically reject the situation in front of him. "This isn't my problem. This isn't my fight," he whispered to himself, his voice breaking. He imagined dark men in suits tracking her down, guns in their hands, storming into his trailer and dragging him away in front of Ethan. He imagined police lights, accusations, courtrooms, and cages. He had already lost everything once in his life. He couldn't afford to lose what little he had left. Saving her could mean destroying his son's only chance at stability. And for a brief, cowardly second, Daniel considered walking away, but his heart refused to let him escape so easily. He paced in circles, running his hands through his dirty hair, breathing fast. He tried to convince himself that someone else would come, that authorities would find her, that fate would assign this burden to another man. But deep inside, he knew that was a lie. No one ever came here unless they were desperate or already broken. If he left her, she would die, alone, buried beneath trash, forgotten like the scraps he collected every day. His gaze drifted back to her face, so fragile, so utterly out of place in that hellish landscape. And with every second that passed, his resistance weakened against the weight of his own conscience. The woman let out a faint, barely audible gasp, her body twitching weakly. That sound shattered the last wall Daniel had tried to build around his fear. His knees buckled slightly as the truth struck him. Whether he wanted it or not, his life had already intersected with hers. Turning his back now wouldn't erase what he had seen. It would only define what kind of man he truly was. And as the wind roared across the dump once more, carrying the stench of rot and secrets, Daniel realized with trembling certainty that he was standing at the edge of a decision that would change everything forever. Daniel knelt beside her again, his heart hammering so loudly it drowned out the distant sound of trucks beyond the landfill. He placed 2 trembling fingers on her neck, barely finding a pulse, weak, irregular, but still there. That fragile rhythm was proof that time was running out. He whispered to himself that he was a fool, that heroes only existed in movies, and that in real life, men like him didn't get rewarded for doing the right thing. They got crushed. Still, as he looked at her broken body, something inside him rebelled against that dark logic. It wasn't courage. It was desperation mixed with memory. The memory of watching Melissa die while he could do nothing, and the unbearable guilt that followed him every day after that. But he had no idea this was only the beginning. He lifted her slightly to check her injuries and saw deep bruises across her ribs, dried blood near the edge of her scalp, and cuts along her legs as if she had been pulled violently across rough ground. Whoever had come after her hadn't intended to let her leave alive. The realization sent a wave of cold terror through him. He imagined those same people finding his footprints, tracing his movements back to the trailer, discovering Ethan. His chest tightened so hard he could barely breathe. This wasn't just about helping a stranger anymore. This was about protecting the only person he had left in the world. And that made the choice somehow even more impossible. Daniel stood up abruptly, stepping back again as if he could physically escape the nightmare forming in front of him. "I can't," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't do this." His mind raced with excuses. The police would handle it better, the hospital would ask questions, the danger wasn't worth it. But deep inside, he knew the truth. If he walked away now and she died, he would carry that stain on his soul for the rest of his life, just like he carried the memory of Melissa's final breath. And for a man already drowning in silent regret, one more weight might be enough to finally pull him under. The woman stirred again, her eyelids fluttering weakly. This time her lips managed to form a sound. It wasn't a word, just a broken whisper of pain, fragile and human. That sound pierced straight through Daniel's fear and lodged itself in the last place still capable of mercy. Without realizing it, he dropped back to his knees beside her. His hands moved on their own, instinct overriding terror. And in that silent exchange between 2 broken souls in the middle of a forgotten landfill, Daniel Walker crossed a line from which there would be no turning back. He took off his worn jacket and gently draped it over her shoulders, trying to shield her from the cold wind slicing through the dump. His hands shook as he slid one arm beneath her back and the other beneath her legs. She was lighter than he expected, dangerously light. As he lifted her, pain racked her body and a faint cry escaped her lips. Daniel froze, afraid he had worsened her condition. For a long second, he considered setting her back down and running away. But then her hand moved weakly and clutched the fabric of his shirt like a child clinging to safety. And in that tiny, helpless gesture, his fate was sealed. With every step he took toward the edge of the landfill, Daniel felt as if unseen eyes were watching him from behind the mountains of trash. His senses sharpened to unbearable levels. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching footsteps. Every shifting shadow looked like a threat. The woman's breathing grew shallower in his arms. Panic surged through his veins. If she died before he reached help, he didn't know what he would do to himself. And as fear and urgency twisted together in his chest, Daniel realized with horrifying clarity that he was now deeply entangled in a story far larger and darker than his own. By the time he reached the dirt road where his old pickup was hidden behind a stack of abandoned tires, his muscles were screaming in protest and sweat poured down his face. He laid her gently in the passenger seat, using torn fabric and his jacket to slow the bleeding as best he could. For a moment, he just stood there staring at her unconscious face, realizing that a single decision, lasting only seconds, had altered the entire trajectory of his life. There was no going back now, and as he turned the ignition and the engine roared to life, destiny tightened its grip around both of them. Daniel slammed the truck door shut and sped away from the landfill, dust exploding behind him as the tires ripped through the dirt road. His hands clenched the cracked steering wheel with desperate force, his eyes darting constantly between the road ahead and the unconscious woman slumped beside him. Phoenix traffic was still sparse at that early hour, but every car that passed felt like a potential threat. Sirens in the distance made his heart leap into his throat. Was he doing the right thing by taking her directly to a hospital? Would that expose her, and him, to whoever had tried to kill her? Questions assaulted his mind faster than he could answer them, and the danger was only growing. He didn't drive toward the nearest hospital. Instead, instinct pulled him toward St. Mary's Free Community Clinic, a small, underfunded medical center known for treating people without insurance and without asking too many questions. It was the same place he had taken Ethan countless times when they couldn't afford proper care. If anyone could help her quietly, it would be them. But choosing that path also meant he would be entirely alone in whatever mess followed. No police protection, no official reports, just him, a dying stranger, and enemies he couldn't see. And as he turned onto the neighborhood streets, he felt the full weight of that reckless gamble settle onto his soul. The woman stirred slightly as the truck jolted over a pothole. Her eyes opened halfway, unfocused and glassy. Her lips trembled again, and this time a whisper escaped, weak, barely audible. "They will come," she murmured before slipping back into unconsciousness. Those 3 broken words froze Daniel's blood instantly. They confirmed everything he already feared. This wasn't an accident. This was a hunt. And without meaning to, he had placed himself and his son directly in the path of it. Daniel parked 2 blocks away from St. Mary's Free Community Clinic, afraid that stopping directly in front of the entrance might attract unwanted attention. He shut off the engine but stayed frozen for a moment, breathing heavily, his heart pounding like a warning siren inside his chest. The woman beside him was growing colder, her breathing so faint it terrified him. He whispered to her that everything would be okay, though he didn't believe it himself. With trembling arms, he lifted her from the seat once more and began walking quickly toward the clinic, every shadow on the sidewalk feeling like a predator waiting to strike, because at that moment, everything started to change. The clinic doors burst open as Daniel staggered inside, shouting for help with a desperation that made nurses and volunteers rush forward instantly. The staff laid her on a stretcher within seconds, wheels squealing as they rushed her down the narrow hallway. A doctor tried to question Daniel immediately. Who was she? What happened? Where did you find her? But his answers came out broken and confused. He only said he had found her injured and alone. He didn't mention the luxury car. He didn't mention the tire marks. He didn't mention the fear clawing at his soul. Some secrets he instinctively knew were already too dangerous to say out loud. As they wheeled her away into the emergency room, a nurse stopped Daniel and asked about insurance. That single word hit him like a slap. He stared at her blankly, knowing exactly what she already knew from the look of his clothes and hands. He shook his head slowly. The nurse gave a quiet sigh, the kind that carried years of exhaustion and compassion, and told him they would do what they could. But Daniel understood what those words really meant. Limited resources, limited time, and no guarantees. He stood alone in the hallway, watching blood-stained sheets disappear behind swinging doors, realizing that saving her life might cost him everything he had left. Minutes dragged into hours as Daniel sat on a hard plastic chair beneath flickering fluorescent lights. He thought of Ethan waking up alone in the trailer, wondering where his father had gone. Guilt tore through him as fiercely as fear. He had made the choice to help, but it hadn't just changed his life. It had pulled his son into danger too. Every sound of footsteps in the hallway made him flinch. Every stranger who passed felt like a potential enemy. His phone buzzed once with a notification from a cheap prepaid carrier, low balance warning. Even the smallest details of his life seemed to mock him now that he had stepped into a world that clearly did not belong to him. But he had no idea how deep he already was. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor finally emerged. Her expression was tight, serious, and cautious. She told Daniel that the woman had suffered multiple blunt force injuries, internal bleeding, and signs of extreme physical trauma. She had likely been assaulted and chased before the crash. If Daniel had arrived even 20 minutes later, she would have died. Those words made his knees weak. The doctor also mentioned something strange. The woman's fingerprints had already been flagged in an internal system connected to a private hospital network, something completely unheard of for a free clinic like theirs. That single detail planted a terrifying seed of mystery in Daniel's mind, and the question of who this woman truly was grew heavier by the second. Before Daniel could even respond, the clinic doors opened again, and this time, two men in dark jackets stepped inside. They didn't look like police. They didn't look like doctors. Their eyes swept the room with cold precision, instantly locking onto Daniel as if they already knew he would be there. One of them murmured something into a device hidden in his sleeve. Daniel's stomach sank. Every instinct screamed the same truth at once. They had found him. And at that moment, trapped in the middle of a quiet clinic with nowhere to run, Daniel realized that helping the woman had officially placed a target on his back. One of the men slowly approached him with a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. His voice was calm, professional, and utterly lifeless as he asked a single question. "Where is the woman you brought in?" The words were soft, but the threat behind them was unmistakable. Daniel's mouth went dry. His body stiffened as the full weight of his decision crashed down on him. Lying could get him killed. Telling the truth could seal her fate, and possibly Ethan's as well. And as silence stretched between them, suffocating and dangerous, Daniel realized his choice to help her had only opened the door to consequences far more terrifying than he had imagined. Daniel felt the air thicken around him as the man's question echoed in the narrow clinic hallway. "Where is the woman you brought in?" The stranger repeated calmly, as if asking about a misplaced document instead of a human life. For a fraction of a second, Daniel considered pointing toward the emergency room and ending it all right there. But then Ethan's face flashed in his mind. Sleepy eyes, messy hair, the quiet trust of a child who believed his father could protect him from anything. His throat tightened. "I don't know who she is," Daniel said carefully. "I just found her. That's all." The man's smile didn't fade. It only grew thinner, sharper. And in that instant, Daniel knew lying had just become his most dangerous weapon. The second man subtly positioned himself near the clinic entrance, blocking the exit with his body as if the move were completely casual. Other patients in the waiting room sensed the shift in energy and fell unervingly silent. A nurse glanced at the men with visible unease, then at Daniel, clearly feeling that something was very wrong. The first man leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "She doesn't belong here," he said. "And neither do you." His tone was gentle, almost polite, but every word felt like a loaded gun pressed against Daniel's ribs. Sweat trickled down Daniel's spine as he realized this was no random search. They knew exactly what they were looking for, and they were willing to take it by force. Just then, the emergency room doors cracked open slightly as a nurse stepped out with blood on her gloves. For the briefest moment, Daniel saw movement inside, the woman's body shifting as doctors worked frantically around her. The man's eyes followed Daniel's instinctive glance. In less than a second, the stranger understood everything. His smile vanished. "Thank you," he said softly. Before turning toward the doors, Daniel's heart dropped into his stomach. If they reached her now, she was as good as dead. And without thinking, driven purely by instinct, Daniel acted. He stepped directly into the man's path. "You can't go in there," Daniel said, his voice shaking but loud enough to draw attention. "This is a medical emergency." The words sounded ridiculous even to his own ears. Who was he to stop men like this? The second man moved instantly, gripping Daniel's arm with crushing force and twisting it behind his back. Pain exploded through Daniel's shoulder. A sharp cry escaped his lips. The waiting room erupted into chaos as patients stood, voices rising in confusion and fear. The first man leaned in close again and whispered, "You should have stayed invisible." And in that moment, Daniel understood that his old life had truly ended. Security rushed in from the hallway, followed closely by clinic staff shouting for police. The grip on Daniel's arm loosened just enough for him to stumble backward. The two men exchanged a fast glance, cold, calculating. They had lost the element of silence. Within seconds, they turned and exited the clinic without another word, melting into the morning streets like shadows at sunrise. Daniel collapsed into a chair, shaking violently as adrenaline drained from his body. He was alive. The woman was still alive. But something far worse had just been set in motion. 10 minutes later, the police arrived. They questioned everyone, nurses, patients, Daniel himself. He told the same incomplete version of the story again and again. Found an injured woman, brought her in, didn't know who she was. The officers exchanged uneasy looks when Daniel described the two men. No IDS. No official markings. No clear explanation. One of the cops quietly warned Daniel that he had likely interfered in something way above his pay grade. That phrase echoed in Daniel's head like a curse. Way above his life. Way above his son's safety. Way above anything he could control. When the police finally left, a hospital administrator approached Daniel with a grim expression. Because there was no identification, no insurance, and no legal guardian for the woman, and because of the violent disturbance, the clinic's legal department had decided to transfer her to a private hospital under state supervision. Daniel tried to protest, but his voice meant nothing in rooms like that. Paperwork ruled lives here. He watched helplessly as orderlies prepared her for transport under police escort. The woman would be moved to a place completely beyond his reach. And the worst part, whoever wanted her dead would certainly know exactly where she was going. Before she was taken away, the nurse who had first received her pulled Daniel aside. With trembling hands, she discreetly pressed something into his palm. A thin gold chain she had found hidden beneath the woman's shirt during treatment. She was holding this when she came in, the nurse whispered. Wouldn't let go. I think it's important. Before Daniel could ask anything more, she hurried away. Alone again, Daniel opened his hand and stared at the small pendant hanging from the chain. A symbol engraved into the metal that he had never seen before. It looked expensive, official, powerful, and utterly out of place in his world. That night, when Daniel finally returned to the trailer, Ethan ran to him with relief flooding his little face. Daniel hugged his son tighter than ever before, his hands still trembling as he tried to pretend everything was normal. But as Ethan fell asleep later, Daniel sat alone at the small kitchen table, turning the mysterious pendant slowly between his fingers. Outside, a black SUV passed slowly down the dirt road without headlights, then disappeared into the darkness. And in that moment, Daniel realized the first true consequence of helping the woman had arrived. He was no longer invisible. And that was the most dangerous thing he could ever be. The collapse didn't start with an explosion or a dramatic confrontation. It began quietly, almost invisibly, the very next morning. When Daniel arrived at the scrap yard to sell the little metal he had collected at dawn, the owner, a man who had known him for years, avoided his eyes for the first time. Without explanation, he refused to buy anything. Orders from above, he muttered nervously. Daniel laughed awkwardly at first, thinking it was a joke. But when he tried 2 other yards and was rejected the same way, the laughter died in his throat. Something unseen was already moving against him, closing doors he didn't even know existed. And that was only the first crack in the structure of his life. By noon, Daniel's phone stopped working. No signal, no service. The cheap prepaid line he depended on for emergencies, especially for Ethan, had been shut off without warning. When he walked to the carrier's small booth to ask what happened, the clerk told him his number had been flagged for irregular activity and frozen indefinitely. Daniel stood there in disbelief, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet. He had never committed a crime in his life. He barely even existed on official records anymore. And yet, somehow, invisible hands were now rewriting the rules of his survival, and he could already feel the pressure tightening. That afternoon, Daniel returned to the trailer park with a deep unease in his chest. As he pulled into the dusty lot, he noticed unfamiliar cars parked near his home. Dark sedans with tinted windows, engines idling quietly. Children who usually played between the trailers had vanished. Even the stray dogs that roamed the area were nowhere to be seen. The air felt wrong, heavy with anticipation. Daniel locked his truck and walked slowly toward the trailer, every step echoing like a warning inside his head. And before he even reached his door, he saw that it had already been forced open. Inside, drawers were scattered across the floor. The thin mattress had been cut open. Clothes were ripped from their shelves and thrown everywhere like the aftermath of a storm. Whoever had been inside wasn't searching for money. Daniel barely had any. They were looking for something specific. His heart nearly stopped when he ran to Ethan's small bed. It was empty. For 2 horrifying seconds, Daniel believed the worst. Then he heard Ethan's voice trembling from behind the bathroom door, where the boy had hidden in terror. When Daniel held his son again, relief nearly made his legs give out. But that relief lasted only a moment, because the message was now unmistakably clear. Taped to the kitchen wall, right above the broken table, was a single white envelope with Daniel's name written on it in clean, elegant handwriting. Inside was only a piece of paper with 6 words printed in bold black ink. "You were warned. Stay out." Daniel stared at the message, his hands shaking violently. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was control. They knew where he lived. They knew about his son. And they were no longer hiding their power. At that moment, everything truly began to fall apart. That night, as Daniel tried to comfort Ethan and pretend the break-in had been nothing more than a burglary, a dark cloud settled over the trailer. The boy asked questions Daniel couldn't answer. Why did they do this? Did I do something wrong? Daniel lied with a broken smile, saying bad people sometimes did stupid things. But inside, guilt clawed at him like an animal. Every consequence now had a face. His son's frightened eyes. And Daniel could no longer escape the truth. His decision to help the woman had pulled innocence directly into the line of fire. Late into the night, unable to sleep, Daniel retrieved the gold chain the nurse had given him. Under the weak trailer light, he examined the symbol on the pendant again. A stylized falcon wrapped around a crown. He searched for it on Ethan's old tablet using stolen Wi-Fi from a neighbor. What he found made his blood run cold. The emblem was linked to a powerful private security corporation rumored to work for billionaires, politicians, and criminal empires alike. People who crossed them didn't end up in prison, they vanished. Daniel dropped the tablet as if it had burned him. The danger was no longer abstract. It had a name, a symbol, and limitless reach just before dawn. As exhaustion finally dragged his eyes closed, the distant sound of an engine rolled slowly past the trailer again. Tires crunched on gravel with deliberate patience. A shadow passed across the thin curtain of Ethan's window. Daniel didn't move. He didn't even breathe. He simply held his son tighter in the darkness, realizing that the world he once knew, poor, brutal, but predictable, had officially ended. And whatever had begun at the dump was now hunting him in his own home. The humiliation didn't explode into Daniel's life all at once. It unfolded slowly, methodically, like a public execution designed to be watched by everyone he had ever known. 2 days after the break-in, Daniel took Ethan to school like he always did, forcing a smile even though his hands were still shaking inside his pockets. But the moment they walked through the front gate, the whispers began. Parents looked at him differently now, suspicious, distant, some openly judgmental. A few children pointed. Ethan tightened his grip on Daniel's hand, sensing the shift without understanding it, and Daniel felt, deep in his bones, that the shame had already arrived before the accusation, before the first bell rang. The school principal stepped outside and asked Daniel to come into the office immediately. The tone of her voice was polite but rigid, the kind of politeness that existed only to hide fear. Inside, sitting at a cheap plastic table, were 2 uniformed police officers. Daniel's heart dropped into his stomach. They informed him that a complaint had been filed anonymously accusing him of involvement in dangerous individuals and criminal activity connected to a violent incident. No evidence. No witnesses. just an accusation. Still, protocol demanded that Ethan be temporarily removed from his custody until an investigation could be completed. The words landed like a death sentence. And in that instant, Daniel realized humiliation wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It was separation. Ethan didn't understand why he wasn't allowed to go home with his father. He cried and begged as a social worker gently pulled him away. Daniel's knees nearly gave out as his son screamed his name in front of the entire school. Parents watched in silence. Some filmed with their phones. Others shook their heads as if confirming rumors they didn't even know the origin of. Daniel tried to follow, but one of the officers blocked his path. "This is temporary," they said. Temporary felt like a lie people told when the truth was too cruel to speak. And as the school doors closed on Ethan's cries, Daniel felt something inside his chest shatter beyond repair. By the time Daniel left the school grounds, his face was already splashed across local social media groups. Someone had filmed everything. The captions were brutal. Poor scrap collector involved with criminals. Single dad suspected of violent connections. Mystery woman linked to local disturbance. Who protected her? Strangers commented freely, judging a life they had never lived. People who once nodded at him in passing now looked at him like a disease. The story spread faster than truth ever could. And Daniel, who had spent years being invisible, was suddenly infamous for a crime he didn't even understand. That afternoon, Daniel returned to the scrap yard out of desperate necessity. He needed money for food, for bus fare, for legal help. But the gates were closed. A handwritten sign hung crookedly on the fence. "No entry. Police order." A group of men stood nearby whispering and staring openly at him. When Daniel approached, one spat on the ground in front of his feet and told him to leave before things got ugly. Daniel didn't respond. He simply turned away, the word criminal echoing silently through his mind as if the world had already convicted him. As night fell, Daniel sat alone on the steps of his dark trailer. His son gone, his work gone, his reputation in ruins. The wind carried distant laughter from other families gathered inside their homes. Sounds of normal lives continuing without him. His phone remained dead. The pendant weighed heavily in his pocket. A silent reminder of the woman whose shadow had destroyed his world without her even being present. And as humiliation settled deeper into his bones, Daniel understood with terrifying clarity that he had fallen to a place lower than poverty. He had become a public enemy without ever committing a crime. Late that night, as Daniel tried to sleep on the floor of the empty trailer, headlights suddenly flooded through the thin walls. A familiar black SUV stopped just outside. A door opened. Slow footsteps approached. Someone knocked softly, deliberately, as if they knew he had nowhere left to run. Daniel's heart pounded violently as he rose to his feet. Whatever humiliation he had suffered today was nothing compared to what was waiting behind that door. And in that fragile silence before he answered, he knew one thing for certain. The worst was still ahead. Daniel stood frozen just inches from the door as the soft knocking echoed again through the thin metal frame. The sound was calm, controlled, not the frantic pounding of a threat, but the confident rhythm of someone who knew time was on their side. His breath came shallow. Every instinct told him not to open it, but running was impossible. The trailer had no back exit, no place to hide. The past 2 days had stripped him of every illusion of safety. Slowly, with hands shaking, Daniel unlocked the door and pulled it open just enough to see the figure standing beneath the dim exterior light. What he saw did not match what he expected, and that alone terrified him. The woman standing outside was in her early 40s, elegant even in the dusty trailer park. She wore a dark blazer, simple but expensive, and her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a tight, disciplined style. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, but not cruel. No weapons visible, no bodyguards in sight. Yet the air around her carried an undeniable authority. "Daniel Walker," she said calmly. "My name is Margaret Hale. I believe you are in terrible danger." The way she spoke his full name made his stomach drop. He had never seen her before, yet she knew exactly who he was. Daniel's first instinct was to slam the door shut, but before he could move, Margaret subtly leaned forward and spoke the words that destroyed his resistance. "Your son is alive, and for now, he is safe." The world tilted violently beneath Daniel's feet. His vision blurred. He grabbed the doorframe to keep from collapsing. "Where is he?" Daniel demanded, his voice cracking with terror and rage. Margaret studied his face for a long moment before answering quietly, "That depends on the choices you make next." And in that instant, Daniel realized this woman was far more dangerous than the men who had broken into his home. She stepped inside without asking for permission, glancing at the destroyed interior with faint disapproval. "They moved faster than I expected," she said coolly, as if discussing business delays instead of a man's ruined life. She explained that the woman Daniel had rescued was not just running from criminals. She was connected to a massive financial empire with enemies both legal and illegal. Powerful people, ruthless people, and now, Daniel had become an unexpected variable in a war he never agreed to join. "You saved someone who was never meant to be saved," Margaret said. "And now, the system is adjusting." Daniel demanded to know who she really worked for. Government? Police? Mafia? Margaret smiled faintly at that. "None of the above," she said, "and all of them depending on perspective." She revealed that she had been tracking the woman for weeks, not to capture her, but to protect her from her own family. That single word, family, rang in Daniel's mind like a warning bell. How powerful did a family have to be if its members required protection from one another? And why had destiny chosen him as the point of collision? Margaret finally told him the woman's first name, Isabella. No last name, just Isabella. According to her, Isabella had tried to escape an arranged financial alliance involving billions of dollars in assets, offshore accounts, and political leverage. What had followed was not a kidnapping attempt, but an elimination order disguised as retrieval. Her own father signed the first order to bring her back, Margaret said softly. The second order was to erase her if she refused. Those words drained the blood from Daniel's face. He hadn't saved a victim of crime. He had saved the target of a powerful dynasty. Daniel staggered backward and collapsed into a chair. Everything suddenly made horrifying sense. The men at the clinic, the intimidation, the shutdown of his phone, the break-in, the public accusation. This was no random storm. This was a controlled demolition of his life. And he was standing at the center of it with no armor and no allies. "Then why am I still alive?" he asked bitterly. Margaret's eyes locked onto his. "Because someone powerful decided you were more useful breathing than silenced. For now." Before leaving, Margaret placed a small prepaid phone on the table. "You will not contact the police. You will not contact social services. You will not try to disappear," she said firmly. "You will wait for my call." Daniel stared at the phone as if it were a ticking bomb. Before stepping out the door, Margaret paused and added one last sentence. Soft, precise, and devastating. "If you run, your son will pay the price." And with that, she vanished into the darkness as quietly as she had arrived. Daniel sat alone for a long time after she left, staring at the cheap phone on the table. His life was no longer his. His son's life was no longer safe. And the strange woman he had rescued at the dump was now the gravitational center of a catastrophe far bigger than poverty, law, or survival. Outside, the black SUV idled briefly, then disappeared once more into the night. And in that silence, Daniel finally understood. Help had arrived, but it came wrapped in terror. Daniel barely slept that night. Every time his eyes closed, he saw Ethan being pulled away at the school, heard Isabella's broken whisper in the truck, and felt Margaret Hale's calm, merciless voice echoing through the trailer. As dawn approached, the fear didn't fade. It multiplied. The prepaid phone on the table remained silent, yet its presence screamed louder than any ringtone. Daniel checked the windows repeatedly, expecting to see armed men at any second. Nothing happened. That silence was worse than gunfire because it meant someone somewhere was carefully deciding his next move, and he had no power over it. By morning, rumors had spread even further. At the local market, people avoided him openly. One woman pulled her child away when Daniel passed, as if he carried a contagious disease. A man who once shared coffee with him after early scrap runs muttered, "Trouble follows you now," and turned his back. No one asked for his version of events. The story had already been written without him. Daniel felt trapped inside a nightmare where truth had no value and guilt was assigned by whispers. And the more he tried to stay invisible, the more the spotlight burned him. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Daniel decided to go to the only place that still connected him to the woman at the center of the storm, the private hospital where Isabella had been transferred. He took 3 buses across Phoenix, keeping his head down, convinced that every passenger was watching him. When he finally reached the hospital gates, 2 uniformed guards stopped him immediately. His name, he discovered, was on a restricted access list. No reasons given. No explanations allowed. He wasn't even permitted to know if Isabella was alive or dead. And that denial crushed him more brutally than any threat. As Daniel turned away from the hospital in defeat, his prepaid phone vibrated for the first time. A single message appeared on the screen. "You were not supposed to go there." His heart nearly stopped. They were watching him in real time. His movements, his choices, his desperation. None of it was hidden. A second message followed seconds later. "Confusion is protection. For now." The words made no sense, but the certainty behind them was unmistakable. Someone was using chaos as a shield and as a weapon. That same afternoon, Daniel was called to a temporary social services office regarding Ethan's custody. He was led into a small white room and questioned by a woman who spoke with mechanical sympathy. She told him new allegations had surfaced overnight. Anonymous claims of violent behavior, criminal associations, and financial manipulation. Daniel nearly laughed at the last one. Financial manipulation. He could barely afford food. But none of that mattered. The file in front of her was already stacked thick with lies that looked like facts. Ethan's case, she said, had become complicated. And nothing terrified Daniel more than that word. On his way out of the government building, Daniel noticed 2 men standing across the street, pretending to check their phones. Their eyes never left him. When he moved, they moved. When he stopped, they stopped. Panic surged through him as he realized the shadow had become physical again. He ducked into alleys, into stores, onto crowded sidewalks. But they remained at a steady distance, never close enough to confront him, never far enough to lose him. It wasn't pursuit. It was pressure, and its purpose was unmistakable. To remind him that he was owned. As evening fell, Daniel returned to the empty trailer, emotionally shredded and drowning in unanswered questions. Who was truly controlling this nightmare? Margaret? Isabella's father? The security corporation behind the Falcon symbol? Or someone even higher? For every question that formed in his mind, 3 more appeared to replace it. The pieces didn't fit, and yet they were all connected. And as Daniel slumped into the same chair where his life had been taken apart only hours earlier, one horrifying truth finally became clear. The more he tried to understand what was happening, the deeper he was being pulled into a war he didn't even know the rules of. The next morning arrived quietly, too quietly. For the first time in days, no new threats appeared on the prepaid phone. No strange cars passed near the trailer. No shadows lingered across the street. The silence felt unnatural, like the calm eye at the center of a hurricane. Daniel woke up with his heart still racing, expecting disaster at any second, but nothing happened. And that scared him more than the chaos ever had. He went to the scrapyard as usual, trying to cling to routine like a drowning man clings to driftwood. The familiar sounds of metal crashing, engines groaning, and workers shouting felt almost comforting. For a few fragile hours, Daniel allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that the nightmare might be loosening its grip. He even smiled once without realizing it. And that small, dangerous smile was the first crack in his guard. At midday, his foreman called him into the office. Daniel prepared himself for the worst: termination, police, maybe another fabricated accusation. Instead, the man handed him an envelope. Inside was a cash bonus. No explanation. No condition attached. Just money. A client wanted to help some of us out, the foreman said casually. Daniel's hands trembled as he counted the bills. Someone was helping him. After everything that had been taken, the idea felt almost unreal. And yet, the timing was impossible to ignore. Later that afternoon, Daniel received another call, this time from the social services office. A new temporary hearing had been scheduled, earlier than expected. The tone of the caseworker had changed as well, softer, less distant. She even said something that nearly brought Daniel to his knees. "There's a chance your son may come home sooner than we thought." For the first time since Ethan was taken, Daniel allowed himself to feel hope rise in his chest. It burned warm, dangerous, and blinding. On his way home, Daniel stopped at the same small diner where he and Ethan used to eat after school on Fridays. The same waitress recognized him and, for the first time in days, didn't look afraid of him. She gave him a free slice of pie and said softly, "Things turn around when you least expect." Daniel nodded, almost believing it. Almost. But deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that nothing in his life moved without permission anymore. That night, Daniel sat alone in the trailer holding Ethan's old drawing. A crooked house, a smiling stick figure father, and a dog that looked more like a monster. He imagined Ethan sleeping safely again in his old bed. He imagined mornings that didn't taste like fear. The illusion wrapped around him gently, like a blanket over open wounds. And for a few precious minutes, the world felt gentle again. Then the phone vibrated. One message. Only 5 words. Relief is part of control. Daniel's breath vanished from his lungs. The air felt heavy, poisonous. The money, the hearing, the sudden kindness. It was all engineered. Every hopeful step he had taken that day had been placed in his path by the same invisible hands tightening around his life. The relief hadn't been freedom. It had been a leash loosened just enough to let him believe he was walking on his own. And as Daniel stared at the dark screen of the phone, understanding crushing his chest, he realized something far worse than fear. They weren't just trying to destroy him anymore, they were trying to reshape him. The next morning didn't bring violence. It brought something far worse, official papers. When Daniel stepped outside his trailer, a man in a dark suit was waiting beside a government-marked vehicle. Calm, polite, deadly in tone. He handed Daniel a sealed envelope and asked him to sign a receipt. Daniel's hands shook as he read the header, Family Court Emergency Order. His mind raced before the words even made sense, and when they did, his legs nearly gave out beneath him. The document accused him of violating court safety protocols, hiding information, and exposing his son to immediate physical risk. Lies stacked on lies, typed neatly with legal authority. The order suspended all visitation rights, effective immediately. No hearing, no defense, no warning. Ethan was now completely out of his reach. Daniel dropped the papers into the dirt without realizing it, his vision blurring as the weight of another stolen future crushed his chest. And the man in the suit was already walking away to the scrapyard. The atmosphere had changed. Conversations stopped when Daniel approached. Eyes turned away. Whispers slid through the metal piles like poison smoke. Someone had spread the story before he even arrived. Court revoked his kid, one man muttered. Must have done something bad, another answered. Daniel felt thousands of invisible fingers pointing at his back. Guilt by rumor. Condemnation without trial. And still, no one asked him what was true. Before lunchtime, the foreman called him into the office again. His face was tight, defensive. "We got a call," he said, "from a government office." Daniel already knew what that meant before the words landed. "Until everything clears up, we're going to have to let you go. No anger, no apology, just procedure, just survival of reputation." Daniel was fired in under 30 seconds. Just like that, his only income erased by invisible hands. By the time he returned to the trailer park, the locks had been changed. A bright orange eviction notice flapped against the metal door like a mocking flag. 48 hours. That was all he had left before the last roof over his head disappeared. Inside were his memories, his son's drawings, his last fragile pieces of dignity. And now even that space had been legally stolen from him. One signature at a time. As night fell, the prepaid phone vibrated again. Daniel already knew who it would be before he looked. "No threats, No shouting, just a calm message that was far more brutal than violence itself. You are now alone. This is escalation. His knees hit the dirt, not from shock, from exhaustion, the kind that seeps into bone and steals the idea of tomorrow from your thoughts. Daniel went to the park where he used to take Ethan after school. The swing still creaked in the same rhythm. The same slide reflected the moonlight in dull silver. He sat on the cold bench, staring at an empty playground that now mirrored his life. Abandoned, silent, frozen in memory. The injustice wasn't just legal anymore. It was emotional warfare. They weren't trying to break his body. They were dismantling his identity piece by piece. For the first time, Daniel whispered the words out loud. They want me erased. Not just poor. Not just silent. Gone. A man without a job, without a home, without a child, barely a man at all in the eyes of the world. And the most terrifying part was how cleanly it was being done. No blood, no crime scene, just signatures, systems, and sealed doors. But even as the darkness pressed tighter around his chest, something dangerous flickered behind his tired eyes. Not hope, not yet. Something raw and unshaped. A refusal to vanish quietly. A question began forming in his mind, painful and electric at the same time. And what if disappearing was exactly what they feared most? Because as Daniel sat alone beneath the flickering park light, colder than the night around him, one truth silently locked into place. This injustice wasn't the end, it was the trigger. The 48 hours passed like a slow execution. Every tick of the clock echoed inside Daniel's skull as if time itself were counting down to his erasure. He packed what little he had into broken boxes and torn trash bags. Clothes worn thin by years of scrapyard dust. Ethan's drawings folded with shaking hands. A rusted pocket knife that had belonged to his father. Each item felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. A life that no longer had permission to exist. And the silence that followed him grew louder with every step that on the morning of the eviction, no one came to say goodbye. Not the neighbor who once borrowed sugar. Not the old man who used to wave from his porch. Curtains moved, doors stayed locked. Fear had rewritten loyalty. The landlord arrived with 2 officers and a clipboard, not with cruelty, but with indifference, which somehow hurt more. "You have 15 minutes, he said, as if granting mercy. Daniel nodded, numb, carrying his last bag out while the officers watched like witnesses to a lawful burial. When he stepped away from the trailer for the final time, the door slammed shut behind him with a sound that echoed like a coffin lid. Everything he had built for Ethan, no matter how small, no matter how fragile, was now sealed behind a metal wall that no longer recognized his name. The sun was bright that morning, disgustingly bright, as if the world itself were mocking him with its indifference. And at that moment, Daniel truly understood what it meant to be homeless in plain sight. With nowhere left to go, Daniel wandered the city on foot until his legs trembled from exhaustion. He passed places that once meant survival, the diner, the bus stop, the scrapyard gate, now transformed into symbols of exclusion. At the scrapyard, the security guard didn't even look at him. He simply invoked the rule. "You're not authorized on this property anymore." 6 years of sweat erased with one sentence. And as Daniel walked away, he felt not just unemployed, but erased from a world that no longer needed him. By nightfall, hunger tightened around his stomach like a living thing. The few bills from the mysterious bonus were already gone, swallowed by food, by storage fees, by the smallest attempts at dignity. Daniel sat behind a closed grocery store, chewing slowly on stolen bread with shaking hands, ashamed not of what he had done, but of what he had become. A shadow eating in silence. A father without a home. A protector without power. That night, rain soaked his clothes as he curled beneath a collapsed awning behind an abandoned gas station. Cold crept into his bones. Every passing car splashed water onto the sidewalk and onto his invisible body. No one saw him, or worse, they chose not to. Daniel pressed Ethan's folded drawing against his chest beneath his jacket, as if holding onto a heartbeat that no longer lived where he could reach it. And the rain felt like judgment falling straight from the sky. Sometime after midnight, his prepaid phone vibrated again. The screen glowed weakly against the darkness. "You have nothing left to bargain with?" the message read. Daniel laughed. A broken sound that barely escaped his throat. Nothing left? They had taken his job, his home, his child, his reputation. What remained? Only breath, only blood, only stubborn existence. And even that felt like it was on loan. For the first time, the idea of giving up crept into his mind not as fear, but as invitation. How long could a man keep standing when everything around him was designed to make him kneel? Daniel stared at the rain pooling on the cracked pavement and wondered, briefly, how easy it would be to simply lie down and let the world step over him forever. The thought scared him not because of how dark it was, but because of how quiet it felt. And yet, beneath the numbness, beneath the exhaustion, something refused to die. Not hope. Hope still felt too painful to touch. It was something colder, sharper. A resolve born from having absolutely nothing left to lose. The kind of resolve that doesn't beg, doesn't ask, only waits for the moment to strike back in ways the enemy never anticipates. As Daniel closed his eyes under the rain-soaked awning, shivering and alone, one terrifying certainty settled into his chest like a ticking device. When a man loses almost everything, he becomes capable of almost anything. The rain stopped just before dawn, but the cold didn't leave with it. Daniel woke up stiff, his clothes soaked, his joints aching like they belonged to someone twice his age. The street was quiet, empty in that uncomfortable way cities get before most people wake up. For a long moment, he stayed exactly where he was, curled against the wall of the abandoned gas station, staring at space as if he had forgotten how to move. The idea of standing up felt heavier than the night itself. His stomach cramped violently. Hunger had stopped being just a feeling. It had become a constant presence, a dull, burning pressure that made thinking difficult. Daniel tried to search his pockets out of pure reflex, even though he already knew there was nothing left. No money, no food, no phone credit for more than 1 or 2 messages. Only a man running on borrowed strength and borrowed time. And even that debt was coming due as the sky slowly turned gray. Daniel dragged himself to his feet and began walking without direction. He passed early commuters waiting for buses with coffee in their hands and headphones in their ears. No one looked at him, or maybe they did and chose not to register what they saw. A homeless man didn't fit into the morning rhythm of productivity and schedules. He was an error in the system, an inconvenience the eyes learned to glide past without guilt. By mid-morning, weakness forced him to sit on the steps of a closed storefront. His head spun, his vision tunneled. The world tilted slightly, as if even gravity was losing interest in keeping him upright. That was when the thought returned. Not dramatic, not violent, just quiet and seductive. You don't have to keep doing this. No more cold, no more hunger, no more humiliation, just rest. Final, perfect rest. Daniel lowered his head into his hands. For the first time since Ethan was born, he imagined a future where he simply wasn't there. No father waiting, no man fighting, just an empty space where suffering used to exist. And the terrifying part wasn't the sadness of that image. It was how peaceful it looked, how silent, how easy. A memory cut through his thoughts without warning. Ethan at 5 years old, falling off his bike and scraping his knee. He hadn't cried at first. He had stood there trembling, confused by pain he didn't yet have words for. And Daniel had rushed to him, lifted him up and said, "It's okay to cry, but it's also okay to stand back up." The memory crushed into his chest with unbearable force, because now Daniel was the one on the ground, and no one was running to lift him. His phone vibrated faintly in his pocket, the last bars of battery barely alive. For a split second, he expected another message from the unseen enemy, another reminder of control, another psychological blade. But this time, the screen showed nothing. No messages, no threats, just the low battery warning blinking like a dying heartbeat. And for the first time, the silence felt heavier than the terror ever had. Daniel stood up unsteadily and walked to a nearby bridge that crossed the narrow river slicing through the industrial district. The water below moved slowly, dark and thick, not violent, not dramatic, just endless motion. He leaned against the rusted railing, staring down. his reflection distorted in the ripples. A man without a home, without a job, without a child, without a future he could touch. The world felt massive above him and impossibly small inside his chest. Tears came without sound. Not loud sobs, not shaking cries, just slow, quiet tears that slid down his face as he whispered Ethan's name under his breath. Again and again, like a prayer that no longer believed in heaven. "I failed you," he said softly to the water. The words didn't feel heavy anymore. They felt empty, and that scared him more than guilt ever could. For a few unbearable seconds, he imagined letting go of the railing, letting gravity decide everything, letting the river erase the question of tomorrow forever. The thought wasn't driven by drama, it was driven by exhaustion, by the simple desire for the pain to stop asking for strength he no longer felt capable of giving. And for a terrifying moment he leaned forward. But just as his weight shifted, something stopped him. Not a miracle, not a voice from the sky, just another memory. Ethan asleep on his chest as a baby, tiny fingers wrapped around Daniel's worn shirt, trusting completely that the man beneath him would not disappear. That trust struck deeper than any threat ever could. Because enemies wanted him broken, but Ethan had needed him alive. Daniel staggered back from the railing, collapsing to his knees on the sidewalk, gasping for air as if he had just been pulled from underwater. The surrender hadn't happened, but the edge had been real, dangerously real. And as he sat there trembling, he understood with brutal clarity that he had reached the point where one more push, one more loss, one more lie, could truly end him. The phone died completely. The screen went black, and as Daniel knelt alone in the street, empty pockets, empty future, empty arms where his son should have been, one final thought echoed through his shattered resolve. Surviving tomorrow would require a reason he no longer knew how to find. When Daniel was already at the very bottom, almost giving up on everything, a small, unexpected gesture reignited his hope. A child he had once helped return just to say thank you, reminding him that his pain had not been in vain. That simple moment brought back a spark of faith in people and in the idea that doing the right thing still mattered, even when the world seemed cruel. Soon after, strange information began to surface. Documents started disappearing from the hospital, doctors behaved nervously, and unanswered questions multiplied. Daniel sensed that something big was being hidden. The more he observed, the more his uneasiness grew, as if an invisible thread connected all the unusual events around the woman he had rescued. Little by little, the suspicion took shape. Nothing about that encounter at the dump had been random. The signs of a violent chase, the luxury car destroyed nearby, the fear in her eyes when she woke up, everything started to align into a terrifying logic. Daniel realized he had been pulled into something far larger than his simple life, that in a desperate attempt to protect her, Daniel made the worst mistake of all. He trusted the wrong person while asking for help. That single act exposed his location and placed both of them directly in the crosshairs of people who were willing to kill to protect their secrets. The truth finally began to crack through the lies. Daniel discovered that the official version of her accident had been completely fabricated. Records had been altered, witnesses silenced, and the hospital itself had been used as a cover for crimes linked to human trafficking and illegal organ operations. The system he had once trusted had been part of the horror all along. The weight of that revelation crushed him. Daniel collapsed emotionally under the realization that he was facing forces far larger and darker than he could fight. He felt deceived, powerless, and deeply guilty for having dragged danger into his already fragile life. The idea that his choice to help might have doomed them both nearly destroyed him. Fear spread quickly. The few people who had once stood beside him began to pull away, afraid of becoming targets themselves. Daniel watched his small circle of support vanish one by one, until even familiar faces avoided him. He became marked as a risk, as someone too dangerous to stay close to. Soon, Daniel lost everything that anchored him. His home, his job, his routines, and his sense of safety disappeared overnight. Now he was not just poor and struggling, he was hunted. He learned to move in silence, to sleep with one eye open, and to exist like a shadow at the edge of society. Yet, while Daniel felt completely abandoned, something powerful was beginning to move quietly in the background. Federal investigators had started piecing together the evidence. The unusual calm that followed the storm was not indifference. It was preparation for something much bigger. An unexpected ally finally emerged. A federal agent approached Daniel in secrecy and revealed that he was now a key witness in an operation aimed at dismantling a massive criminal network. Without fully realizing it, Daniel had become one of the most dangerous men alive to a billion-dollar empire. Soon, the truth began to leak. Journalists uncovered missing patients, arrested doctors, and shadow companies linked to medical crimes. The news spread fast, sending shockwaves through industries that had hidden behind prestige and power for decades. Then the past came rushing back with brutal force. Daniel discovered that the woman he had rescued was not just a victim. She was the heir to a powerful medical dynasty deeply involved in the very crimes now being exposed. Her identity had been erased to silence her. Once again, Daniel stood at a crossroads. He was offered protection and a way out, a chance to disappear and save his own life. But choosing safety would mean abandoning the truth, and everyone still trapped in the nightmare that in his most difficult moment. Daniel made the same choice he had made at the dump. He chose to do what was right, even if it destroyed him. He agreed to testify and fully cooperate with the authorities, knowing that his decision could cost him everything. His courage was met with the first real reward of his life. Daniel was placed into a federal protection program, given a new identity, and received his first legal financial compensation, not as charity, but as justice. Soon after, a partial financial turnaround transformed his life forever. The money that once felt impossible now sat in his account, heavy with responsibility. Instead of consuming it, Daniel invested it into anonymous mobile medical clinics to serve the homeless and victims of trafficking. The man who once survived on scraps became a silent force of healing, though unseen enemies still watched from the darkness. At last, the ultimate truth was revealed. The mysterious woman disclosed her real identity as Evelyn Whitmore, daughter of a medical empire tied to widespread criminal operations. The crash at the dump was never an accident. It had been an execution attempt. When her enemies located Daniel, they attacked, and the hidden war burst into open violence. The final confrontation came swiftly. Federal forces intervened, arrests were made across multiple states, and the criminal empire collapsed in full view of the world. The case became national news. Daniel testified publicly, not as a hero, but as a witness who had chosen compassion over fear. Evelyn recovered her rightful inheritance and, in a powerful act of justice, shared her fortune with the man who had saved her life. Together, they built a network of real healing for the forgotten. And the poor single father from the dump was no longer just a survivor. He became a man who changed lives with truth, courage, and purpose.